How's it going? Thursday, October 5th, 2023. This video, I wrote a book. Baseball is a numbers game. This video, best hitters between 1870 and 1879. Why? Just for the fun of it. I'm going to focus on Hall of Fame players, those who made the Hall of Fame. Do you know in the baseball's history, 150 years, roughly starting 1870s, roughly, through 2022, that's about, through 2020, would be 150 years, right? 1870, 2020, 150 years. There's been about 19,000 baseball players played in the major league level, not the minors, about the major leagues, the higher divisions. Before the turn of the century, before the turn of 1900, like from 1870 to 1900, you had the National League. Then after 1900, you had the American League. I want to point out, as far as Hall of Fame players, who are the best hitters between 1870 and 1879? Do you know? Jim O'Rourke, during that 10-year period, had 730 hits. Doesn't seem like a lot, right? 730, you'd average about 73 hits a year. But they were only playing 80, 90, 100 games. At the most, 100 games. He had 362 runs batted in through that 10-year period. And his highest batting average was 362. Jim O'Rourke, he was the best hitter between 1870 and 1879. And he made the Hall of Fame. You know who's number two? Cap Hansen. 691 hits in that decade. 326 runs batted in, and 1 year he had a 415 batting average. But again, it's about 70, 80 games. Not a full 150 or 160 game like they're playing today. 162 game season now. And for a long time, it was a 154 game season. Who's number three? King Kelly. You heard of him? 187 hits, 78 runs batted in, and 348 was his highest batting average. Doesn't seem like very much, but King Kelly, good hitter, made the Hall of Fame. For John Ward, 131 hits in that decade. Just very few games. 56 runs batted in. His high batting average was 286. And then the last guy who made the Hall of Fame during that decade, 1870 to 1879, he played baseball, but he made the Hall of Fame after it was established. 1930s, the Hall of Fame got going in the 1939. Is that it? So after that, they elected players, and they looked back on the past. Dan Brothers made it. He only had 46 hits during that decade, 17 runs batted in. His high batting average was 274. What am I trying to prove right here? During the 1870s, 150 years ago, there were 5 players that made the Baseball Hall of Fame. And they played in this decade. Jim O'Rourke, Cap Hansen, King Kelly, John Ward, and Dan Brothers. What do you think? Let me do something here. Let's look up these guys, okay? And I'll show to you why they made the Hall of Fame. Let's start with Jim O'Rourke. He had the most hits during this decade. I'll get him up here on my computer screen. I've got his stats. If you go to Baseball Reference, that's where you can find his stats. So he played from 1872 through 1904. 23-year career. But during the 1870s, like I said, he had 730 hits. That's the most of any players who played in that decade who made the Baseball Hall of Fame. His career batting average, .310. He ended up with 2,600 hits. Jim O'Rourke. Number 2, Cap Hansen. You know him, right? Played a long time. I've got his stats here. 27 years in the big leagues. Ends up with 3,435 hits. But he started 1871. And through that decade, got 691 hits. He had a .415 one year. But he only played 46 games. He had 90 hits and 217 at-bats. 1872. .415. It's not really measuring a full season, is it? 46 games. That just shows you, though, that he was one of the quality hitters who played back then. Who's number 3? King Kelly. Oh, I should mention that Cap Hansen, career batting average, .330. He ends up with 3,435 hits. Cap Hansen. Who's third? Best player in that decade? King Kelly. He only had 187 hits during the decade. But he had a 16-year career, ends up with 1,800 hits total, at a .307 lifetime batting average. He got going 1878, 1879, so he's got about 137 games, and he got 187 hits. King Kelly. And then you have John Ward. He's an interesting guy here, because he pitched and batted. He got going late, too. As far as the decade, 1878, 1879. So he gets about 110 games and gets 131 hits. He had a career batting average .275, but he was a pitcher. He pitched a perfect game. John Ward. And then the last guy I'm covering in this decade, Dan Brothers. Interesting guy here. His first year, 1879, but he played in the decade, and he makes the Hall of Fame. That's why I've got him included. 5 guys made the Hall of Fame who played in the 1870s. And Dan Brothers, 46 hits during that year, just 39 games. But he had a career batting average, Dan Brothers, .342. And ends up with 2,300 career hits. I thought it was interesting to cover this decade. Who made the Hall of Fame among batters? Okay, so my next video, I'm going to cover the decade 1880 to 1889. How many players in this decade made the Hall of Fame, and who were the ones who dominated that decade? We'll get into it next. Thanks for watching. I'm out.